Hey everybody, it's Professor Snart checking in here. Hard to believe we are almost at basically midterm in the 16-week semester. I don't know if it just has gone by really quick or partly it's the weather hasn't quite turned yet, so it still feels like February basically. But anyway, here we are looking at Unit 8 basically. So we've just finished up our first poetry unit in our Intro to Lit course here. Trying to think about sort of like how poetry is really so everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So hopefully you got a sense of, and we're maybe even surprised to find how frequently it occurs. And I think there were some really great examples in our Padlet. Some examples of text that really was poetry. You could tell even if it was functioning almost like as an advertisement, or how products like to tell a little story about themselves or communicate a feeling of some kind. It's really interesting to see when poetry is used for that. So again, that sense of poetry is, there's clearly like line breaks used in specific spots, and the word, not just order, but kind of the arrangement on the page or the space wherever it exists really matters. And then there's other examples where we get something that's kind of close to that, but maybe a little bit different. And honestly, I'd want us to kind of recognize this difference between what we can guess to be like a really intentional use of something like a line break. And honestly, in some ways, like that's the difference between poetry and prose. It's hard to be really definitive about how these things are different, like what makes short fiction prose and what makes poetry poetry. In many ways, it's like just the use of space on the page, including like line breaks. And then there's a thing called prose poetry, which is just muddies the water, but we don't really discuss that at all. Anyway, the point being that there were examples, I think, of really pure poetry where you could tell that there were intentional line breaks created by an author or some, corporate advertising group or whatever thing produced the item that we're looking at. And then I think there's other examples where we can see how things emerge as poetic because of the way that the words exist in the space of the page or the car mirror or whatever the example might be. But in some cases, we sense that the line breaks are occurring, or the arrangement of the words in space are maybe less intentional on an author's part, and more just a matter of like compressed space. So they had to break the line because the words don't otherwise fit. And then there's some gray area, right, where it's hard to tell, did they, like some author or group or whatever, intentionally choose to break words there? If they wanted it broken differently, couldn't they have changed the font or the font size? In some cases, like with things that are almost like visual works of art, like you'd see hanging in my kid has one in her playroom, for example, reading books is good, saying bad things is bad, whatever, one of these kind of things. Each saying occupies its own space on the page, so there's kind of like line breaks because each line is a thought. But the creator of that item has also worked with, font size and spacing, and some of the things are turned so we have to read them like up and down on the page instead of left to right. So there's all of those things that go in as well that produce a kind of poetry. So there's sort of like degrees of intentionality on the author's side that we can guess at, that creates the sense for us that this is like specifically supposed to be poetry. This is meant to look a certain way in a visual field. And then this other example, kind of at the other end of the continuum, is more like words arranged in space, but they take the shape that they do because of the constraints of that space itself, not because some author or group definitely wanted to end the line here and start the next line down further. All that being said, though, I think it's really interesting to see how all around us are examples of words existing in this kind of like visual field in ways that are clearly not just like short fiction, like we would just read across the page and across the page and across the page. So poetry is both something that most people would say that they don't read, they don't have much exposure to. Oh yeah, I read a poem when I was in grade 8, whatever. And yet it's everywhere, right? And that's not even including lyrics, which I think are kind of a different animal altogether. Although, of course, we encounter those for most people on like a daily basis. Okay, So we're going to jump away from that consideration, kind of an umbrella consideration about poetry, into a really like sort of traditional form and a really granular look at a particular form, the sonnet, which I'm sure you've all heard of, probably read a few. Don't know if you've written any before, but that's what we're going to take a look at here. So our Unit 8 actually has two, I won't call them major assignments, but parallel assignments. So there's some reading that you are asked to do. These are all sonnets, and you can be the judge of whether Billy Collins's contemporary poem called Sonnet is in some ways or not a sonnet. But they all are ostensibly sonnets. You'll notice that there's lots of variations. Some of them are old and very traditional, like Shakespeare, for whom one sonnet form is named the Elizabethan or Shakespearean sonnet. Wordsworth's more almost like conversational use of the sonnet form. How Do I Love Thee, which is a poem that many people know, even if you never realized it was a sonnet before. And then a really great early 20th century example of the sonnet, Edna St. Vincent Millay's What Lips My Lips Have Kissed and Where and Why. I think I mentioned this in this video below, down here. But if you ever see a title of a sonnet like the Shakespeare one, the Wordsworth one, Edna St. Vincent Millay's one with the square brackets, it means that the author didn't actually give that sonnet a title. Like this one I think is Sonnet 116. Shakespeare just numbered them. So what editors do, to put a textbook together or to make these things findable in an index, and findable by people like teachers and students who are looking for them by their common title, is they'll just take the first line of the poem and make that the title, obviously still repeating that as a first line, but the square brackets indicate that this is an editorial decision, not something that the author intended as the title or whatever. So if you ever wondered about that, now you know. Okay, so quick reads, right? All sonnets are like 14 lines here, so that's all you've got to deal with for each of these, but hopefully you get the sense that we have a good mix of different kinds of sonnets. And then I might actually even reorganize this after I finish this video, but there's one assignment here, and then there's some material about the sonnet form. In this case, I'm going to cover the Elizabethan or the Shakespearean sonnet, again using the Shakespeare model that we just read above. There's a little video. I actually shot this in using a different course, so you might see some differences like in the menu or whatever. But the concepts are the same here. Some of the aspects of what go to make sonnet form or the rules for sonnets. I would even encourage you just to Google some of this stuff. Like look at Wikipedia. They have some good, really accessible, easy to read material about the Elizabethan sonnet and the other major variation or form called the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet, named after Petrarch, who is actually named or alluded to in Billy Collins's sonnet here. So one assignment is going to have you picking from any of the sonnets that we read up here. Doesn't matter which one, pick the one that just sort of speaks to you for whatever reason, and then read it aloud. So I don't really expect people to memorize the thing. It's going to end up being kind of like a video assignment, even though, it's really just your voice that we're concerned with here. But you don't have to be on camera. You can think of creative things or ways to film this. And again, you're not even either memorizing the thing like a Shakespearean actor would. You're not, but by the same token, you're not just reading it off the page. So you really do want to make an effort to sort of perform it, which means understanding, and this is why I'm going to reorder things, some of the rules for how sonnets work, in terms of the rhythmic devices, the rhyme scheme, how the pieces kind of fit together and that sort of thing. Don't feel obliged to perform the iambic pentameter, which is the rhythmic device here, so that it just sounds all like weird and clunky and kind of robotic or mechanical. But it is good for us to realize that that beat is actually happening underneath the lines that we would otherwise want to deliver much more naturally. But you also sort of have to think about, like, if you're performing this as if you were the speaker of this poem, which is not always just the author, but there might be some other like character involved, really try to think of and feel like, what is this person trying to say? Are they upset? Are they head over heels in love? Are they being sarcastic? And does that change as the sonnet progresses? It's not just one kind of static delivery. So the advice that actors will always get is to slow down. I know you haven't even done anything yet, but slow down. Everybody goes too fast. It feels unnatural for us to speak slowly, to pause and just let there be kind of like dead air in there. But really trust that your performance can work that way, that slower is generally better, that you feeling like you're being kind of over the top in emoting this thing is actually not the case. It'll just sound performed at the end of it. It might sound or feel a little weird to you, but again, from the audience's perspective, what feels hyperbolic from the performer is really just like normal performance to the audience. If you've ever done theater, you learn this repeatedly, right? And from the very beginning, to be loud, to slow down so people can understand what the hell you're saying, and what feels like really dramatic and kind of ridiculous performance on your part, especially in true theater where you have an audience that's like at a distance from you, is that over the top. It really doesn't appear that way. It just feels that way to you. So anyway, reading aloud or performing a sonnet, considering some video element to go with it, even though you don't have to personally be on camera unless you want to. Throw it into YouTube, build out your portfolio page, kind of the usual stuff here. Reply to at least 2, posting the URL to your updated portfolio page up here for our first discussion board. So that's one assignment. The next is pretty straightforward in some ways, is just to write a sonnet. So keep in mind that these 2 main assignments are going to be due for that first due date in Unit 8. It's not like we have the double due date system, so again, don't get confused by that. And here, I'm not really grading the so-called quality of the sonnet that you write. Is it super profound? Is it poetic? Is it really funny? Whatever. You can take whatever tone you want. I'm more interested to see, is there evidence that you understand and can put into practice the various rules that govern sonnets, like we cover here, like I walk through in the video here, some of which are easy, like the number of lines, some of which are fairly straightforward, like the way that the rhyme scheme works that I've marked out here, and then some that are a lot more challenging, and I think it's the iambic pentameter that's the most challenging for people. So read the stuff, watch the stuff here, Google more resources and explanation if you feel like you need it, but that's really what I'm looking for, is the application of the so-called rules. The other thing to note is that we're going to do our best to really follow strictly the rules of the sonnet, even though if we go back to our various sonnets that we read here, we'll see that these authors really bend and play with the rules. In this one especially, in this one, Wordsworth takes a lot of liberties. Even in Shakespeare's own sonnet, the dude for whom the Shakespearean sonnet is named will often deviate from like the strict iambic pentameter rules that we should be following. He does it actually in a fairly consistent way and in certain places, and then otherwise he tends to follow the rules pretty closely. But we're going to not do that and really follow the rules as closely as possible. Again, hopefully a slightly more interesting way of learning about this particular poetic type without just like reading about it and then, I don't know, doing a test or writing an essay, whatever. So same thing, you can write directly on your portfolio page or do a Google Doc. Either way, you're building out your portfolio with another Unit 8 page here for writing the sonnet. Post, again, to this discussion board, and then note, again, the reply. So just to remind, 2 main assignments here due on that first due date, and then the replies can follow later. Okay? All right, so I'm going to be out of town starting on Tuesday. Not that it really affects us or is going to be obvious in any way. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to do a video check-in until I'm kind of back next week. But this one takes us through this current week and current unit. And by email, I should be able to still be in touch with people in a pretty normal way. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can always reach out to me. And fingers crossed, in a week or so, maybe we'll actually have some spring weather and it'll feel like we're past midterm in the 16-week spring semester.